always like to start with something, a little tidbit of information that's come my way over the course of a week's time. And one of the websites that I watch for is called theshopkeepers.com. And I love this website because they feature interesting little shops around the world. These are not the big box stores, the big department stores. These are cute, charming, delectable little stores all over the world. And this week they were featuring the best shops for linen. And it was just fun to go through and look at the websites of those individual stores and just see what they were selling. A lot of them are selling finished goods. Other people are selling fabrics that they've dyed, hand dyed, embellished in some way. So I think you would enjoy this website. There's nothing to buy. There's nothing to pay for. It's just one of those beauty sort of things that comes along that makes you feel good and makes you want to travel, actually, and go see some of these shops. One of my favorite looks on this website is just all the great photography of some of the storefronts around the world that are just old, vintage, and just love it. Some of you know I love architecture and doors and windows, and I do a lot of hand stitching, based on some of the photography that I take when I'm on my trips, mostly of doors and storefronts and building fronts and so forth, so I'm all into that. Today we're going to talk about the MixIt top. The MixIt pattern is a pattern that we've had for quite a while, and it includes 3 patterns: the MixIt shirt, MixIt top, MixIt tank. And the reason we named it the MixIt is that all 3 of these styles mix with so many of the other patterns that we have and other styles that we have. Today I've chosen to feature the MixIt top. All of this started because Kathy Davis had a little bit of fabric, not quite enough, and she decided to make a MixIt and add some ribbing to it to make it longer. And then one thing led to another, and she made another one for Erin, a little bit longer. And so I thought to myself, I love that idea. I'm going to do that for myself. So I'm wearing my version of it today, which I'll talk about in a little bit. But first of all, I want to tell you about the special features of the MixIt top. If you've never made it, maybe you look at the picture of it on the website or on the pattern, and you think, well, that's just kind of ordinary. But there are some really interesting things about this pattern that you may want to pay attention to. Here it is in its original form. If you were to just take the pattern out of the envelope, this is what you could make. It has a nice little Mandarin collar, and for those of us of a certain age where we want a little more around our necks, it's just enough, but not too much. It has a keyhole opening with a loop and a button. The sleeves are cap sleeves, pretty short, sometimes too short, so I'm going to talk about that. It has side slits, which you can sew in or eliminate. But one of the things that you don't pick up on until you are looking at the pattern is the shoulder seam is curved. And years ago, when I owned the sewing workshop school in San Francisco, we had a teacher by the name of Charmaine Fouché, and she was wonderful at teaching about couture jackets and really high-end ready-to-wear. And if you take apart some of those Armani jackets, some Laurent jackets, some of those great old vintage pieces, you will note that shoulder seams are not cut straight across, but they're cut on the curve. Well, you can see on me that it looks like it's straight, but I actually sewed the curve in, and so it's just a more flattering, soft form that really, I think, is flattering to the body and flattering to your shoulder. So this is the original. This is in a silk charmeuse. Charmeuse is a fabric that is shiny on one side and more matte on the other side. And it's one of those silk fabrics that can be a little bit challenging to wear, to sew. And I guess it can be challenging to wear as well, but it's definitely challenging to sew. We're going to talk about how to tackle that a little bit today and some of the tricks for taming sewing fabrics like silk charmeuse. So this is the original, and this is the one that Kathy made for Erin. She lengthened the sleeve a little bit and lengthened the body of it and added a 6-inch piece at the bottom of ribbing. And then to emulate the black and bring it back up to the top of the garment, this is a little bit of silk, not ribbing, but it brings the black back up to the top. This is a silk crepe. We don't have either one of these fabrics that I've just shown you, but I just wanted to show you how beautiful they can be in silk. And yet I think the ribbing adds that element of sportiness to the garment. So when I decided to make this one, I decided to lengthen the sleeves even more, and I added a 2-inch band, thanks to my friend Samantha, who was here last week, who said, oh, just put bands on the end of that sleeve. And I went, oh my gosh, you know, not everyone has the benefit of having a sewing buddy around to give them even more ideas. Sometimes I get really stuck in my ways and just make something just like the pattern, but other people can see what needs to be done or what can be done and share ideas with you, and I think that's really fun. So then I put a band on the bottom, a 2-inch band, and rather than using ribbing, I used just black knit, a jersey knit, which we have in viscose and cotton blends and several different combinations of fibers. But I'm really happy with this. I ended up only lengthening the body of this garment 1 inch and added the 2-inch band, and it's just really perfect, I think. And I purposely am wearing it today with my lightest jeans for 2 reasons. I wanted to show you that you can wear silk with denim, and I wanted you to be able to see this black band against something lighter, where I might wear these. In fact, I put this on this morning with my black cotton and light grip Picasso pants, and it looked great, but you couldn't see the black band, so I purposely just dressed in something that you could see the band. In this case, the denim. And then I decided, well, I'm talking about sporty tops, I'm talking about sporty pants. All right. So let's talk about some of the pattern work that has to happen. This particular pattern does have a lengthen and shorten line on it, and there's a reason that lengthen and shorten lines are placed where they are on patterns. Yes, it's possible to lengthen anything at the bottom, but we put lengthen and shorten lines in specific places for a reason, and that is to keep the proportions intact when you are lengthening or shortening a garment. So pay attention to that. And all I did with this pattern is lengthen this pattern 1 inch. This pattern was lengthened 6 inches. I did it 1 inch. But let's talk about the sleeve. So how do you decide how much to lengthen a sleeve and how to do it? Well, I literally took a tape measure and dropped the tape measure from the bending point of my arm, that drop-off point, the end of the shoulder, and decided how long I wanted the sleeve. And I added, in this case, about 1 inch because I wanted a little bit of blousing. Actually, I wish I'd done a little bit more. If I'd had time or of mind, I might have taken the sleeves out and cut them again, but you know, that's way too much work when this is pretty good. So I laid some tissue paper under my sleeve pattern. You can see how this original cap sleeve is very curved. I just ignored that. Laid some paper underneath the pattern. I measured from the finished dot. I made a medium in this. And so from here, I measured down, in this case, 12 inches, or 15.5 inches. That was the length that I had determined that I wanted the length. And continued my lengthwise grain line. So that's the center of the sleeve. Then I put a tape measure around my forearm and left a little bit of ease, thinking about how much I wanted to ease into the band, and determined that I wanted 12 inches in circumference. So from the center line, I went 6 inches each way. Then I added a seam allowance on each side. And then all I had to do was reconnect from the original point of the end of the sleeve cap down to my new width. And then of course I folded this up. I wanted a 5/8 inch seam allowance in order to attach that to my band. And I folded that up, and I can get the exact profile then of the shape of this new seams. So that's as simple as it can be for lengthening a sleeve. This is not just for the MixIt top, it's for any time you want to lengthen or shorten a sleeve. It's pretty much standard. Sometimes I might curve this a little bit, particularly if I'm not putting a band and I want a little more graceful shape to my sleeve. But in this case, because I knew I was going to gather it onto a band, I knew that straight would be just fine. All right, let's talk about cutting out your silks. Now, when I use the word silk today, I'm really talking about a lot of different things that are not just silk. I'm talking about silkies. It might be viscose, it might be rayon, it might be a blend, but it's anything that's very difficult to control and is slimy, I'll call it. That's a pretty good word for it, actually. Any fabric that wants to move on the table is more difficult to cut out and definitely has that tendency to move on you when you sew it. So first of all, you want to cut out single layer. I know you don't like to hear that, but it's true. There are a lot of reasons to cut out something single layer. One is you can save fabric. Generally, you can get more pieces in more areas than if you try to cut out with something on the fold. So remember that if you're a little bit short of fabric, try laying anything out, not just in silk, but in knits and anything, single layer, and I guarantee you can probably get your pattern out of less yardage than what the envelope calls for. But to me, in this case, the real reason to cut out single layer is you want perfect straighted grain. If you don't cut out these silky type fabrics with perfect straighted grain, I've made garments where they just do not hang correctly. You'll get all kinds of waviness to them, distortion, and it just doesn't work. And it's more difficult to sew, actually, when things just aren't squared up. So you want to pull a thread or tear the fabric, whatever will happen. Charmeuse doesn't happen to tear, so you have to pull a thread and cut on the perfect straight of grain. Or I'm always willing to tear a fabric if it will tear, because then you know it is absolutely on the straight of grain. So single layer, and because in the case of charmeuse there's a sheen, you want to be sure that your pattern pieces are laid out with as if there were a nap. So the shine is in the same shine, or whether it's back, front, sleeve, or whatever. All pieces of the pattern go in one direction. I use weights on my pattern tissues rather than pinning the tissue. I find that pinning distorts the fabric, moves it too much. I also use a rotary cutter, and I have changed the blade so it's a fresh blade. If I don't have a fresh blade, then I'm going to pull out my micro-serrated scissors with a long blade to them that have a little bit of serration to them that tends to grab the fabric. So when I'm cutting, the fabric is not getting ahead of me. Either way, but I'm a rotary cutter person 99.9% of the time, and only when it's the middle of the night and I don't have a fresh rotary blade, I'm using scissors. To mark, I'm a big advocate of tailor's tacks using silk thread, but I have to admit I get a little bit lazy about that sometimes. And in the case of this garment, I was able to use my Chocopel pencil. I really like these. I can stick a pin through a marking on the tissue, going through the fabric, then I pull the fabric back, and I just take this little pencil and mark right where the pin enters the fabric. These packages of Chocopel come in various colors. There's white, yellow, pink, and blue, and there's an eraser on the end, but honestly, I've never figured out if this eraser really works or not, but I'm all about the other end, which is the pencil part of it. There is a sharpener included. I've lost many of those, so I have a sharpener at home that's a little more reliable than this. But I think you'd really like these for marking not just silks, but knits and a lot of things. This is my, after tailor tax, this is my next best marking tool. Okay, let's talk about interfacing. This particular garment doesn't require a lot of interfacing, but I do think that the Mandarin Collar does need to be interfaced. Now this collar is unique in that the seam is at the center back of the collar. And that means there is no seam at the front edge. That is a fold. So you have less bulk at the front of that collar, which is really nice, and you don't have that little connection there that can sometimes be troublesome. So in our pattern instructions, we ask you to interface just half of the collar piece. But I interface the entire piece, both sides, so my collar is interfaced nicely on both the front and the back of the collar. And the interface that I used is our wonderful Japanese ultra sheer interfacing. This is one of the colors that we have. We have it in white and black and this natural color. And you can feel the little gritty side of it. That's the gluey side. That's the side that obviously goes down on the fabric. We also have another interfacing that's also very ultra sheer, that is for woven fabrics, and it is wider and comes from Europe. So we have our European and we have our Japanese. Now the Japanese one is the one that we've carried for years. I've used it, I have loads of it at home, always enough yardage on hand to use. You know, you buy this in 1 to 5 yard sections. The trouble now is that the Japanese prices have gotten really high. So we brought this in from Europe, and I like it very much as well. 2 different prices. This one is twice as much money as the European one. So just keep that in mind when you're ordering. If price is a factor for you, then you may want to go with the one that we've gotten from Europe. So what about sewing, stitching? The thing we love to do most, and we've spent all this time altering our patterns and cutting out and thinking about what we're going to do, and the sewing is all of a sudden the easiest part. Well, I use a cotton thread on silk, but I use a special cotton thread, which is a 2-ply cotton thread from Metler. And I hesitate to say this, but it does say embroidery on it. But don't think about it as embroidery thread. It just happens to say embroidery thread on it. So it's a lighter weight thread. I'm going to use it with my 60/8 millimeter needle. So the smallest needle that I can possibly thread in my sewing machine. And by the way, if you have one of the automatic threaders on your sewing machine, it doesn't like a 60 needle. So you're going to have to thread that by eye. I've learned the hard way that needle threader does not really like anything much lower than a 75, even a 70 it doesn't really like. I've broken that feature on my sewing machine. At any rate, as you know, you can now order thread from us at the same time that you're ordering your fabric. And so if you order a silk or a silky or a lightweight fabric, maybe even a voile, we're going to give you this kind of thread. You don't have to specify that on your order. We're going to automatically include this weight of thread, the appropriate weight of thread for the fabric that you have chosen. And some of you may already know that we choose whether it's polyester or cotton, and then we're going to change the weight of the cotton if we need to. Several years ago, in the Threads issue number 139, I always can remember this because it has the buttons on the front of it. I wrote an article called Seam Finishes for Silks. And so this outlines lots of different possibilities for you for choosing the right seam finish. For this, I did a couple of things. For the shoulders, I sewed the seam and then I serged the seam together using my isocord thread because it's very silk-like as well and very lightweight. So when you serge like this, you're not going to get a lump when you press the seam. We've talked about isocord before. You can buy it online or you can buy it from your local Bernina dealer. For the side seams,
The guide sheet said to sew the seam and press it open. So I serged using 3 threads each edge, sewed the seam and pressed it open, and then quickly remembered after I'd done that we had written it that way because the pattern normally has a side slit, and so you want to be able to continue the pressing of open, pressing the vent open as well. Well, I didn't do the vent, so I probably wouldn't have had to have done that, but it is a very non-bulky seam finish, and it worked well. You have to practice a little bit. You want to have a serger where you can control the look of your stitch and the tension of your stitch, and I can do that on my serger and my overlock machine. So I can be sure and get a really flat, very narrow serged edge on my silks. A French seam is another really great possibility. If you're having trouble with your serger behaving and you can't get the look that you want, then I suggest investigating how to do a French seam. I'm not going to teach you how to do that in this Facebook Live. Just know that that is in the magazine, or it's in our tutorial called Sewing with Silks, or you can look it up in any number of your encyclopedias of how to sew certain things. So the bands. I actually struggled over these bands way more than even sewing the silks. I discovered in this that I have 2 different circumferences of forearms. Some of you may know I'm a tennis player. Well, apparently tennis adds a little bit of bulk to whatever handed you are, and I'm right-handed. So when I measured my forearm from my right hand to determine how long to cut the knit, that was one size. And then I put the same band on the left side, and it was very droopy. So you may or may not want to pay attention to that, but the idea is to measure where on your arm this band is going to be placed. I did not add anything but seam allowances, so I didn't add anything as if this was going to be really tight on my arm. I just wanted it to fit. And this ended up being smaller, of course, than what I was going to gather into it. So just like a neckband, when I applied it, I divided my band into quarters, and I divided the sleeve into quarters, matched those 4 points with pins, and then I was able to sew on the band side, stretching that to match the raw edge of the silk from pin to pin, pin to pin for each quarter. The same thing for the band at the bottom. I measured where I wanted this to sit, and I added seam allowances. Again, I quarter marked. I thought about more than quartered because it's so much bigger, but it actually worked just fine to just quarter mark the bottom band and quarter mark the bottom of the shirt as well. So that's bands. Oh, let me talk about pins for just a second. I do use some really good pins, and every once in a while I just brush away all the pins that I have, throw them in the wastebasket, and buy new pins. We have these wonderful pins from Japan that are glass head pins in the red and the white. And we also have these, they're called quilting pins, fine quilting pins that are longer and very flexible. And both of them are really, really great for these silky fabrics. Get rid of your daggers. You don't want pins that have burrs on them that are bent. They're going to snag the fabric, and they're going to cause a little bit of a run in your fabric, which is not great. One other technique I want to talk to you about, which I've talked about in previous Facebook Lives. Actually, I have 2 more things to talk to you about, I guess, now that I look at my little table here. So this loop needs to be very small. And the way to get a really, really small loop is to, first of all, cut a section of fabric on the bias. We have a pattern piece in the pattern that's exactly the right width. And you could fold the fabric in half once you've cut that, and sew as narrow as you can, knowing that you're going to use this tool, which is a ballpoint bodkin. It has a little ball on one end and an eye on the other end. So you know that you can have and achieve a bias loop that is as same diameter as the little ball of this end. That's pretty small. So once I fold my bias in half, I can, and by the way, I would have trimmed that seam down a little bit so it's not filled so much. I didn't do it on this sample. I put this bodkin down into the little tube that I've made so that the eye is at the top. And then I'm going to take some needle and thread and I'm going to sew through that eye and wrap the top so that I can then begin to pull this out. And you can see how narrow that little loop gets. And then I just cut off my bodkin, determine the length that I need based on the button that I'm using, and fold it and sew it in. I own every kind of point turner that was ever invented. This is the best one because you can do endless lengths of bias tubing, miles of it, or just a short piece like this. And it's a very inexpensive tool. You don't need anything else. This is it. The other tool I want to talk to you about is for pressing the collar. So there are two pieces to the collar. There's a seam around the top of the collar. And in order to get a really crisp edge there, after you've sewn this together around the top of the collar, then you want to trim the seam down to about 3/8 of an inch, and you want to press that seam open. And you want to press that seam open over a wooden rail. This is a point presser. This happens to be a clapper as well, but this is a point presser. You put that seam on top of this, press the seam open, then that will really, really bring that well of the seam up and be able to turn so you're not fiddling and trying to maneuver that seam into place with your fingers, which I've done for years. The steaming and getting that seam flat first really does the trick. We have these made here in Topeka, Kansas. They're hard to find now. These are really, really nice pieces, and we have these for sale as well. All right. I want to show you some fabrics. On my left here are fabrics that I thought would look really good with either black ribbing or black knit. Here's the black knit. This is the one I used. Has a lot of stretch to it. It's viscose, which means it's rayon. And all of these, in my opinion, would look great with black. This one, I love this. This looks like Lafayette 148. They have a lot of prints that look like this. Blue, black, and of course my favorite color of yellow green. This one is viscose, meaning rayon. This is super silky and drapey, but it is polyester. And I love the fact that it has this relatively sort of a nice Asian motif to it. It reminds me of the tops of umbrellas in Japan. I've never been to Japan, but I've seen pictures of things like this. I love this one. This is viscose as well, this really abstract. My colors, of course, on a black background, a little bit of gray to it as well, but the various shades of greens and yellows. We can't seem to get enough of animal prints. This one is silk. This is a silk charmeuse, so it has the shiny side on one side and the more matte side on the other. And you can use either side, by the way, as your right side, even though the shiny side in this case, in most cases of charmeuse, is the right side. I've certainly used my share of wrong side or matte sides to the fabrics. This one is rayon. This is upside down hanging from here, but what this really is roosters. These are roosters that form this little stripe, but the way it was rolled on the bolt and hanging here, the roosters are on their heads. But we can't sell enough chicken and rooster fabric. We have 2 or 3 of them here and they just, pardon me, fly out of here. So all of these are super drapey and would look great with the ribbings and the black knit to bring them down into a more casual, sporty top. Over here, we have some silks. We have two from Betsey Johnson. I love Betsey Johnson's sensibility of color. This is the one, obviously, that I have on. And you can see that it does have a sort of diagonal line, which I really like. And I did, believe it or not, make some attempt to continue that diagonal line at the side seams. I wasn't too finicky about it, but I did think about it when I laid this out and, managed to get it pretty good. This is another silk charmeuse of Betsey Johnson's, very fresh and beautiful, these gorgeous pinks and reds on this is something I just noticed looking at this. The background of this has a very faint skull and crossbones motif on it. Very Betsey Johnson, with the overprint of the flowers. I thought that this particular knit, which is a viscose knit, would be great bands and trims for any of these two silk charmeuses or the one above. We just got this in. This is fun. This is silk and viscose, so it's a rayon and silk combo. Again, it's upside down, but you can get the idea. These are eyeballs, eyelashes, and lips and teeth, and some words and some little squiggles, and this is totally cool. And I like the idea of using it with either the burgundy. We also have other ribbings in a gold color. We have ribbing in a grape color that would be really great with it. Some of our ribbings, in fact, most of our ribbings are sold as a tube. You just cut them along a fold and create a single layer. So just because they're knitted in a tube doesn't mean you have to use them like that. That's just how they're sold. I have a couple of others that I really like. This is I better look before I say. They always look like silk, but they're not. Viscose. Viscose has really changed since the olden days of my viscose days, where the rayon fabrics were kind of dull and didn't hold the dye, but now they're just gorgeous. Look at this pretty thing. All these gorgeous fall colors. As the leaves are falling, I'm thinking about that. And let's see if I can get this. Put it with this color of knit. Hopefully you can see this. That'd make a great trim color. Or if you just want to make a beautiful shirt or jacket and you want to have a t-shirt or something underneath or pants in the mustard knit, that would be great too. And one more. This is the one I almost used to make my shirt that I was going to wear today, because I'm madly in love with this and I'm definitely going to use it. I love this print, but as you study it, you realize that the way to cut this out would be on the cross grain, that the motif is actually more pleasing and probably meant to be this way. And that is totally fine. The drape is the same either way. It's perfectly permissible to cut a fabric on the cross grain if the motif is preaching to you like that. And then I was going to use this knit as the band and choose a section of this. I was going to use it on the normal cross grain and just choose whatever section I thought was pleasing with the print. So now I want to show you what I would wear with this. I came in this morning and it was kind of cold in the office. The weather has turned and I needed to put something on. So the first thing I put on was my E vest. E meaning it's a download pattern. We don't talk about our E vest very much, and I don't know why. I love vests. I love just a little bit of a second layer, but I don't always want a long sleeve or a bulky garment. This has a shorter back, a little bit longer front. This is in a crinkled linen. Well, then it was still cold. So I went to the closet, so to speak, and put on my good old standard pearl jacket in black linen knit. This is the garment that I put on a lot when I just need that little lightweight layer for a little bit of warmth, a little bit of coverage. Make sure I'm all put together here. And this is the one that has the drawstring that you can actually insert or not. And you can draw it up and create a totally different look to this. So this is the pearl jacket. So now I'm really layered up. Pearl jacket, E-vest, MixIt top. All right, let's try on one more combination. Another E-vest. If you have followed anything going on in the runway, you know that it's print on print on print. I love the way this one has been bound in some knit. This is a woven fabric, but the binding is knit, and I do that a lot. I love the print on top of print. And then we have another pearl jacket in our viscose and wool boucle. This time without the drawstring. This is a color that I actually think I can wear, even though I get accused of always wearing the same sort of earthy tones. I don't know. I put this on this morning, stood in front of the mirror and thought, I can wear this color, I think. But I love this. I love the whole idea of this kind of garment as this outer layer. So again, an E-vest and the pearl jacket. One more for you. Another pattern that we don't talk about very much, but is so clever and so easy to make because it is two pattern pieces. This is the E jacket, also a download pattern. And it has a very interesting neck construction. It has a tuck that becomes sort of your neck shoulder seam. But isn't this just the cutest little jacket just to throw on? Has a little bit of, it still has tailor tacks in it, so you know Kathy made it. It has some easing and gathering along the sleeve. It can have a little tie sometimes to bring it in like this. This one doesn't have the tie. That's a great little jacket. All right, we have some tutorials that you might be interested in. One called Sewing with Silks, and that goes through in-depth from cutting out types of fabrics, types of silk fabrics, cutting out, sewing, stitching, seam finishes, hem finishes, other tools. So that's something that you may want to pay attention to. We also, let's see, Sewing with Silks. Yes, and so in that tutorial, we go from start to finish of how to construct the Stella top. The Stella is one of the patterns in the Stella and Luna pattern. And this is the exact garment actually that's featured in that Sewing with Silks tutorial. There's one other tutorial that we have. It's called Anatomy of a Sleeve. And that goes into how to lengthen and shorten a sleeve, how to insert a sleeve. So it's also a useful tutorial that you might be interested in. So we have specials today, of course. We have some patterns. We have printed patterns, the Stella and Luna, and the MixIt, and the Pearl and the Opal. All three of those patterns are $18. We have two download patterns, the E-vest and the E-jacket, and they're $12. The two tutorials, Sewing with Silks and Anatomy of a Sleeve, are $15. And all of the fabrics that I've talked about, including, oh, I need to show a couple of fabrics that I forgot to show. Including the black knit, are on sale. We do have two crinkled fabrics that make either the E-jacket or the pearl jacket or any other jacket that you want. We have a linen knit in black, and we have a wool knit in black. Either one of these would make wonderful E-jackets, pearl jackets, drapey jackets of any kind. So they're also in the sale mix as well. All right.
We did have one question about the stitch length with the silks. Did you mention?
Stitch length for sewing silks. You know, when I turn on my Bernina, it's a 2.5 millimeter stitch length. And I dial that down to a 2.4, sometimes a 2.3. But obviously I'm testing first, making my little sample, make sure that everything's behaving before I really get into the sewing of the garment. But 2.4 is pretty much my standard stitch length now for most things, including silk. All right. Okay. Thanks so much, everybody. We'll see you next week.